Hello my lovelies and welcome. So today we're going to be finishing Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I wasn't sure whether to just split the end into two parts. However, I think we're just going to do one long one because I realised that it's been a little while since I last read to you. I've got a lot of videos sort of in my head that I want to do, and a lot of videos that are sort of follow on things like philosophy, the Dairy Girls video. So there's lots of videos that like series almost, you know. I thought, get this finished. I thought, why not make it just a longer video for you to enjoy? And at the end, I'll sort of maybe mention a couple of books that I could maybe read next. But yeah, so let's get started. Okay, Chapter 21, Goodbye Violet. This gum, Mr. Wonka went on, is my latest, my greatest, my most fascinating invention. It's a chewing gum meal. It's that tiny little strip of gum lying there is a whole three-course dinner all by itself. What sort of nonsense is this? Said one of the fathers. My dear sir, cried Mr. Wonka, when I start selling this gum in the shops, it will change everything. It will be the end of all kitchens and all cooking. There will be no more shopping to do, no more buying of meat and groceries. There will be no knives and forks at mealtimes, no plates, no washing up, no rubbish, no mess. Just a little strip of Wonka's magic chewing gum, and that is all you ever need at breakfast, lunch and dinner. This piece of gum I've just made happens to be tomato soup, roast beef and blueberry pie, but you can have almost anything you want. What do you mean? It's tomato soup, roast beef and blueberry pie, said Violet Beauregarde. If you were to start chewing it, said Mr. Wonka, then that is exactly what you would get on the menu. It's absolutely amazing. You can actually feel the food going down your throat and into your tummy, and you can taste it perfectly, and it fills you up. It satisfies you. It's terrific. It's utterly impossible, said Veruca Salt. Just so long as it's gum, shouted Violet. Just so long as it's a piece of gum and I can chew it, then that is for me. And quickly she took her own world record piece of chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it behind her left ear. Come on, Mr. Wonka, she said. Hand over this magic gum of yours, and we'll see if the thing works. Now, Violet, said Mrs. Beauregarde, her mother, don't let's do anything silly, Violet. I want the gum, Violet said obstinately. What's so silly? I'd rather you didn't take it, Mr. Wonka told her gently. You see, I haven't quite got it quite right yet. There are still one or two things. Oh, to blazes with that, said Violet. And suddenly, before Mr. Wonka could stop her, she shot out her fat hand and grabbed the stick of gum out of the little drawer and popped it into her mouth. At once, her huge, well-trained jaws started chewing away on it like a pair of tongs. Don't, said Mr. Wonka. Fabulous. It's tomato soup. It's hot, creamy and delicious. I can feel it running down my throat. Stop, said Mr. Wonka. The gum isn't ready yet. It's not right. Of course it's right, said Violet. It's working beautifully. Oh my, what lovely soup this is. Spit it out, said Mr. Wonka. It's changing, shouted Violet, chewing and grinning both at the same time. The second course is coming up. It's roast beef. It's tender, juicy. Oh boy, what a flavour. The baked potato is marvellous too. It's got a crispy skin and it's all filled with butter inside. But how interesting, Violet, said Mrs. Beauregarde. You are a clever girl. Keep chewing, baby, said Mr. Beauregarde. Keep right on chewing. This is a great day for the Beauregardes. Our little girl is the first person in the world to have a chewing gum meal. Everybody was watching Violet as she stood there chewing this extraordinary gum. Little Charlie Bucket was staring at her absolutely spellbound, watching her huge rubbery lips as they pressed and unpressed with the chewing, and Grandpa Joe stood beside him, gaping at the girl. Mr. Wonka was wringing his hands and saying, "No, no, 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 it isn't ready for eating. It isn't right. You mustn't do it." "Blueberry pie and cream," shouted Violet. "Here it comes. Oh my, it's perfect. It's beautiful. It's exactly as though I'm swallowing it. It's as though I'm chewing and swallowing great big spoonfuls of the most marvellous blueberry pie in the world." "Good heavens, girl," shrieked Mrs. Beauregard suddenly, staring at Violet. "What's happening to your nose?" "Oh, be quiet, Mother, and let me finish," said Violet. "It's turning blue," screamed Mrs. Beauregard. "Your nose is turning blue as a blueberry." "Your mother's right," shouted Mr. Beauregard. "Your whole nose has gone purple." "What do you mean?" said Violet, still chewing away. "Your cheeks," screamed Mrs. Beauregard. "They're turning blue as well. So is your chin. Your whole face is turning blue." "Spit that gum out at once," ordered Mr. Beauregard. "Mercy, save us," yelled Mrs. Beauregard. "The girl's going blue and purple all over. Even her hair is changing colour. Violet, you're turning violet. What is happening to you?" "I told you I hadn't quite got it right," sighed Mr. Wonka, shaking his head sadly. "I'll say you haven't," cried Mrs. Beauregard. "Just look at the girl now." Everybody was staring at Violet, and what a terrible, peculiar sight she was. Her face and hands and legs and neck, in fact the skin all over her body, as well as her great big mop of curly hair, had turned a brilliant purplish blue, the colour of blueberry juice. "It always goes wrong when we come to the dessert. It's the blueberry pie that does it. But I'll get it right one day. You wait and see." "Violet," screamed Mrs. Beauregard, "you're swelling up." "I feel sick," Violet said. "You're swelling up," screamed Mrs. Beauregard again. "I feel most peculiar," gasped Violet. "I'm not surprised." "Great heavens, girl," screeched Mrs. Beauregard. "You're blowing up like a balloon." "Like a blueberry," said Mr. Wonka. "Call a doctor," shouted Mr. Beauregard. "Prick her with a pin," said one of the other fathers. "Save her," cried Mrs. Beauregard, wringing her hands. But there was no saving her now. Her body was swelling up and changing shape at such a rate that within a minute it had turned into nothing less than an enormous round blue ball. A gigantic blueberry, in fact. And all that remained of Violet Beauregard herself was a tiny pair of legs and a tiny pair of arms sticking out of the great round fruit and little head on top. "It always happens like that," sighed Mr. Wonka. "I've tried it 20 times in the testing room on 20 Oompa Loompas, and every one of them finished up as a blueberry. It's most annoying. I just can't understand it." "But I don't want a blueberry for a daughter," yelled Mrs. Beauregard. "Put her back into what she was at this instant." Mr. Wonka clicked his fingers, and 10 Oompa Loompas appeared immediately at his side. "Roll Mrs. Beauregard into the boat," he said, "and take her along to the juicing room at once." "The juicing room?" cried Mrs. Beauregard. "What are they going to do to her in there?" "Squeeze her," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got to squeeze the juice out of her immediately. After that, we'll just have to see how she comes out. But don't worry, my dear Mrs. Beauregard. We'll get her repaired if that's the last thing we do. I'm sorry about it all, I really am." Already the 10 Oompa Loompas were rolling the enormous blueberry across the floor of the inventing room towards the door that led to the chocolate river, where the boat was waiting. Mr. and Mrs. Beauregard hurried after them. The rest of the party, including little Charlie Bucket and Grandpa Joe, stood absolutely still and watched them go. "Listen," whispered Charlie. "Listen, Grandpa. The Oompa Loompas in the boat outside are starting to sing." The voices, 100 of them singing together, came loud and clear into the room. I'll just show you the little picture. "Dear friends, we surely all agree there's almost nothing worse to see than some repulsive little bum who's always chewing gum. That's a long one. It's very near as bad as those who sit around and pick the nose. So please believe us when we say that chewing gum will never pay. This sticky habit's bound to send the chewer to a sticky end. Did any of you ever know a person called Miss Bigelow? This dreadful woman saw no wrong in chewing all day long. She chewed while bathing in the tub. She chewed while dancing at her club. She chewed in church and on the bus. It really was quite ludicrous. And when she couldn't find her gum, she'd chew up the linoleum, or anything that happened near a pair of boots, the postman's ear, or other people's underclothes, and once she chewed her boyfriend's nose. She went on chewing till at last her chewing muscles grew so fast that from her face her giant chin stuck out just like a violin. For years and years she chewed away, consuming 50 bits a day, until one summer's eve, alas, a horrid business came to pass. Miss Bigelow went late to bed. For half an hour she lay and read, chewing and chewing all the while, like some great clockwork crocodile. At last she put her gum away upon a special little tray, and settled back and went to sleep. She managed this by counting sheep. By now, how strange, although she slept, those massive jaws of hers still kept on chewing through the night, even with nothing there to bite. They were, you see, in such a groove they positively had to move. And very grim it was to hear, in pitchy darkness, loud and clear, this sleeping woman's great big trap opening and shutting, snap, snap, snap. Faster and faster, chop, 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 the noise went on. It wouldn't stop, until at last her jaws decide to pause and open extra wide, and with the most tremendous chew, they bit the lady's tongue in two. Thereafter, just from chewing gum, Miss Bigelow was always dumb, and she spent her life shut up in some disgusting sanatorium. And that is why we'll try so hard to save Miss Violet Beauregard from suffering an equal fate. She's still quite young, it's not too late. Provided she survives the cure, we hope she does, we can't be sure. That's brutal. Okay, chapter 22, Along the Corridor. Well, 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 sighed Mr. Willy Wonka. 2 naughty little children gone, 3 good little children left. I think we'd better get out of this room quickly before we lose anybody else. But, Mr. Wonka, said Charlie Bucket anxiously, will Violet Beauregard ever be all right again, or will she always be a blueberry? They'll dejuice her in no time flat, declared Mr. Wonka. They'll roll her into the dejuicing machine and she'll come out just as thin as a whistle. But will she still be blue all over? Asked Charlie. She'll be purple, cried Mr. Wonka. A fine, rich purple from head to toe. But there you are. That's what comes from chewing disgusting gum all day long. If you think gum is so disgusting, said Mike TV, then why do you make it in your factory? I do wish you wouldn't mumble, said Mr. Wonka. I can't hear a word you're saying. Come on, off we go. Hurry up, follow me. We're going into the corridors again. And so saying, Mr. Wonka scuttled across to the far end of the inventing room and went out through a small secret door hidden behind a lot of pipes and stoves. The 3 remaining children, Veruca Salt, Mike TV, and Charlie Bucket, together with the 5 remaining grown-ups, followed after him. Charlie Bucket saw that they were now back in one of those long pink corridors with many other pink corridors leading out of it. Mr. Wonka was rushing along in front, turning left and right and left, and Grandpa Joe was saying, "Keep a good hold of my hand, Charlie. It would be terrible to get lost in here." Mr. Wonka was saying, "No time for any more messing about. We'll never get anywhere at this rate." And on he rushed, down the endless pink corridors, with his black top hat perched on the top of his head, and his plum-coloured velvet coattails flying out behind him like a flag in the wind. There's a picture, sorry, forgot. They passed the door in the wall. "No time to go in," shouted Mr. Wonka. "Press on, press on." They passed another door, then another, and another. There were doors every 20 paces or so along the corridor now, and they all had something written on them, and strange clanking noises were coming from behind several of them, and delicious smells came wafting through the keyholes, and sometimes little jets of coloured steam shot out from the cracks underneath. Grandpa Joe and Charlie were half running and half walking to keep up with Mr. Wonka, but they were able to read what it said on quite a few of the doors as they hurried by. "Eatable marshmallow pillows," it said on one. "Marshmallow pillows are terrific," shouted Mr. Wonka as he dashed by. "They'll be all the rage when I get them into the shops. No time to go in, though. No time to go in." "Lickable wallpaper for nurseries," it said on the door. "Lovely stuff, lickable wallpaper," cried Mr. Wonka, rushing past. "It has pictures of fruits on it, bananas, apples, oranges, grapes, pineapples, strawberries, and snozzberries." "Snozzberries," said Mike TV. "Don't interrupt. The wallpaper has pictures of all these fruits printed on it, and when you lick the picture of a banana, it tastes of banana. When you lick a strawberry, it tastes of strawberry. And when you lick a snozzberry, it tastes just exactly like a snozzberry." "But what does a snozzberry taste like?" "You're mumbling again," said Mr. Wonka. "Speak louder next time. On we go, hurry up." "Hot ice creams for cold days," it said on the next door. "Extremely useful in winter," said Mr. Wonka, rushing on. "Hot ice cream warms you up no end in freezing weather. I also make hot ice cubes for putting in hot drinks. Hot ice cubes make hot drinks hotter." "Cows that give chocolate milk," it said on the next door. "Ah, my pretty little cows," cried Mr. Wonka. "How I love those cows." "But why can't we see them?" asked Veruca Salt. "Why do we have to go rushing on past all of these lovely rooms?" "We shall stop in time," called Mr. Wonka. "Don't be so madly impatient." "Fizzy lifting drinks," it said on the next door. "Oh, those are fabulous," cried Mr. Wonka. "They fill you with bubbles, and the bubbles are full of a special kind of gas, and this gas is so terrifically lifting that it lifts you right off the ground, just like a balloon, and up you go until your head hits the ceiling, and there you stay." "But how do you come down again?" asked Charlie. "You do a burp, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "You do a great, big, long, rude burp, and up comes the gas, and down comes you. But don't drink it outdoors. There's no knowing how high up you'll be carried if you do that. I gave some to an old Oompa Loompa once out in the backyard, and he went up and disappeared out of sight. It was very sad. I never saw him again." "He should have burped," Charlie said. "Of course he should have burped." I stood there shouting, "Burp, you silly ass, burp, or you'll never come down again." But he didn't, or couldn't, or wouldn't. I don't know. But maybe he was too polite. He must be on the moon by now. On the next door it said, "Square sweets that look round." "Wait!" cried Mr. Wonka, skidding suddenly to a halt. "I'm very proud of my square sweets that look round. Let's take a peek." Chapter 23. Square sweets that look round. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view, and looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table there were rows and rows of small white square-shaped sweets. The sweets looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more sweets. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "Square sweets that look round." "They don't look round to me," said Mike TV. "They look square," said Veruca Salt. "They look completely square." "But they are square," said Mr. Wonka. "I never said they weren't." "You said they were round," said Veruca Salt. "I never said anything of the sort," said Mr. Wonka. "I said they looked round." "But they don't look round," said Veruca. "They look square." "They look round," insisted Mr. Wonka. "They most certainly do not look round," cried Veruca. "Veruca, darling," said Mrs. Salt, "pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you." "My dear old fish," said Mr. Wonka, "go and boil your head." "How dare you speak to me like that?" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Oh, do shut up. Now watch this." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, and it flung open. And suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows of little square sweets looked round quickly to see who was coming in. Can you see how they're looking round? How funny. The tiny faces actually turned towards the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. "There you are," he cried triumphantly. "They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square sweets that look round." "By golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "On we go. We mustn't dawdle." "Butterscotch and butter gin," it said on the next door they passed. "Now that sounds a bit more interesting," said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. "Glorious stuff," said Mr. Wonka. "The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tiddly. Listen, you can hear them in there now, whooping it up." Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. "They're drunk as lords," said Mr. Wonka. "They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like that best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't keep stopping like this." He turned left, he turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. TV, the only women now left at the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. "This way," cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. "Go slower," panted Mrs. Salt. "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "We should never, ever get there in time if I did." "Get in where?" asked Veruca Salt. "Never you mind. You just wait and see." Chapter 24. Veruca in the nut room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. "The nut room," it said on the next door. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment and catch your breath, and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" "Crikey," said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts." "Why use squirrels?" Mike TV asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult. But in my factory I insist upon only whole walnuts. Therefore I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? The way they get those nuts out, and see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the rubbish chute. There, look. Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now." They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly, he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy," shouted Veruca suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart. These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits, 2 parakeets, 3 canaries, a green parrot, a turtle, and a bowl of goldfish, a cage of white mice, and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," said Mrs. Salt soothingly. "Mummy will get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can. But I don't want any old squirrel. I want a trained squirrel." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of these squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," answered Mr. Wonka. She can't have one. Who says I can't? I'm going to go in and get myself one this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small, black, beady eyes. I'll just show you the squirrel quickly. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. "All right, I'll have you." She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground, and 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulder and started to tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping on the side of her head with his knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go. Down the rubbish chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her," cried Mrs. Salt. Too late, she's gone. And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go to?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main rubbish pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory?" "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cocoa beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go to in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course. To the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry, there's always a chance that they've decided to not light it today." "A chance? My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now, see here, Wonka," he added. "I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump. I don't mind admitting that, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir. I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca," shouted Mrs. Salt, "are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right direction, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole, head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a lot of rubbish there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Regina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear," cried Charlie, who was now watching with the others through the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. "They only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky." "Shh!" Grandpa Joe said. "Listen, here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began. These are the squirrels. Veruca Salt sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the rubbish chute. And as we very rightly thought that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through, we finished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca, down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet, as she descends, a rather different set of friends. To those that she has left behind, they won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. "Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you?" And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liverwurst so old and grey one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's new-found friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mum and Dad, and that is why we're glad they fell into the rubbish chute as well. Chapter 25. The Great Glass Lift. "Never seen anything like it," cried Mr. Wonka. "The children are disappearing like rabbits. But you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash." Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him on the corridor. There were only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket, and there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. "Shall we move on?" Mr. Wonka asked. "Oh yes," cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe, both together. "My feet are getting tired," said Mike TV. "I want to watch television." "If you're tired, then we'd better take the lift," said Mr. Wonka. "It's over here. Come on, in we go." He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. The doors slid open. The 2 children and the grown-ups went in. "Now then," cried Mr. Wonka, "which button shall we press first? Take your pick." Charlie Bucket stared around him in astonishment. This was the craziest lift he'd ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls and even the ceiling were covered all over with rows and rows and rows of small black push buttons. There must have been 1,000 of them on each wall, and another 1,000 on the ceiling. And now Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny printed label beside it, telling you which room you would be taken to if you pressed it. This isn't just an ordinary up and down lift, announced Mr. Wonka proudly. This lift can go sideways, longways, and slantways, and any other way you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory. No matter where it is, you simply press the button and zing, you're off. Fantastic, murmured Grandpa Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows of buttons. The whole lift is made of thick, clear glass. Walls, doors, ceilings, floor, everything. Everything is made of glass so that you can see out. But there's nothing to see, said Mike TV. Choose a button, said Mr. Wonka. The two children may press one button each. So take your pick. Hurry up. In every room something delicious and wonderful is being made. Quickly, Charlie started reading some of the labels alongside the buttons. The Rock Candy Mine, 10,000 feet deep, it said on one. Coconut ice skating rinks, it said on another. Then, strawberry juice water pistols, toffee apple trees for planting out in your garden, all sizes, exploding sweets for your enemies, luminous lollies for eating in bed at night, mint jujubes for the boy next door, they'll give him green teeth for a month, cavity-filling caramels, no more dentists, stick jaw for talkative parents, wriggle sweets that wriggle delightfully in your tummy after swallowing, invisible chocolate bars for eating in class, sugar-coated pencils for sucking, fizzy lemonade swimming pools, magic hand fudge. When you hold it in your hand, you taste it in your mouth. Rainbow drops, suck them and you can spit in 6 different colours. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. We can't wait all day. Isn't there a television room in all of this lot? Asked Mike TV. Certainly there's a television room. That button over there. He pointed with his finger. Everybody looked. Television chocolate, it said on the tiny label beside the button. Whoopee! Shouted Mike. That's for me. He stuck out his thumb and pressed the button. Instantly, there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors clanged shut, and the lift leapt away as though it had been stung by a wasp. But it leapt sideways, and all the passengers except Mr. Wonka, who was holding onto a strap from the ceiling, were flung off their feet onto the floor. Get up, cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were staggering to their feet, the lift changed direction and swerved violently round another corner, and over they went once more. Help, shouted Mrs. TV. Take my hand, madam, said Mr. Wonka gallantly. There you are, now grab this strap. Everybody grab a strap. The journey's not over yet. Old Grandpa Joe staggered to his feet and caught hold of a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach as high as that, put his arms around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The lift rushed on at the speed of a rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up on every steep, slanty course as if it were climbing a very steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to the top of the hill and gone over a precipice, it dropped like a stone, and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up into his throat, and Grandpa Joe shouted, Yippee, here we go. And Mrs. TV cried out, The rope is broken, we're going to crash. And Mr. Wonka said, Calm yourself, my dear lady, and patted her comfortingly on the arm. Just show the picture. And then Grandpa Joe looked down at Charlie, who was clinging to his legs, and said, Are you all right, Charlie? Charlie shouted, I love it. It's like being on a roller coaster. And through the glass walls of the lift, as it rushed along, they caught sudden glimpses of strange and wonderful things going on in some of the other rooms. An enormous spout with brown sticky stuff oozing out of it onto the floor. A great craggy mountain made entirely of fudge, with Oompa Loompas all roped together for safety, hacking huge hunks of fudge out of its sides. A machine with white powder spraying out of it like a snowstorm. A lake of hot caramel with steam coming off of it. A village of Oompa Loompas with tiny houses and streets, and hundreds of Oompa Loompa children no more than 4 inches high playing in the streets. And now the lift began flattening out again. But it seemed to be going faster than ever, and Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it hurtled forward, and it twisted and it turned, and it went up and it went down. And I'm going to be sick, yelled Mrs. TV, turning green in the face. Please don't be sick, said Mr. Wonka. Try and stop me, said Mrs. TV. Then you'd better take this. And he swept his magnificent black top hat off his head and held it upside down in front of her mouth. Make this awful thing stop, ordered Mr. TV. Can't do that. It won't stop until we get there. I only hope no one's using the other lift at the moment. What other lift? The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this one, said Mr. Wonka. Holy mackerel, cried Mr. TV. You mean we might have a collision? I've always been lucky so far, said Mr. Wonka. Now I am going to be sick, yelled Mrs. TV. No, not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat. The next moment there was a screaming of brakes, and the lift began to slow down. Then it stopped altogether. Some ride, said Mr. TV, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. Never again, gasped Mrs. TV. And then the doors of the lift slid open, and Mr. Wonka said, Just a minute now. Listen to me. I want everybody to be very careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff around in here, and you must not tamper with it. Chapter 26. The Television Chocolate Room. The TV family, together with Charlie and Grandpa Joe, stepped out of the lift into a room so dazzlingly bright and dazzlingly white they screwed up their eyes in pain and stopped walking. Mr. Wonka handed each of them a pair of dark glasses and said, Put these on quick, and don't take them off in here whatever you do. This light could blind you. As soon as Charlie had his dark glasses on, he was able to look around him in comfort. He saw a long, narrow room. The room was painted white all over. Even the floor was white, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. From the ceiling, huge lamps hung down and bathed the room in a brilliant blue-white light. The room was completely bare, except at the far ends. At one of these ends there was an enormous camera on wheels, and a whole army of Oompa Loompas was clustering around it, oiling its joints and adjusting its knobs and polishing its great glass lens. The Oompa Loompas were all dressed in the most extraordinary way. They were wearing bright red spacesuits, complete with helmets and goggles. At least, they looked like spacesuits. They were working in complete silence. Watching them, Charlie experienced a queer sense of danger. There was something dangerous about this whole business, and the Oompa Loompas knew it. There was no chattering or singing among them here, and they moved about over the huge black camera slowly and carefully in their scarlet spacesuits. At the other end of the room, about 50 paces away from the camera, a single Oompa Loompa, also wearing a spacesuit, was sitting at a black table, gazing at the screen of a large television set. Here we go, cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down with excitement. This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate. But what is television chocolate? Asked Mike TV. Good heavens, child, stop interrupting me, said Mr. Wonka. It works by television. I don't like television myself. I suppose it's all right in small doses, but children never seem to be able to make it in small doses. In small doses. They want to sit there all day long, staring and staring at the screen. That's me, said Mike TV. Shut up, said Mr. TV. Thank you, said Mr. Wonka. I shall now tell you how this amazing television set of mine works. But first of all, do you know how ordinary television works? It's very simple. At one end where the picture is being taken, you have a large cine camera, and you start photographing something. The photographs are then split into millions of tiny little pieces which are so small that you can't even see them, and these little pieces are shot out into the sky by electricity. In the sky they go whizzing around all over the place until suddenly they hit the antenna on the roof of somebody's house. They then go flashing down the wire that leads right into the back of the television set, and in there they get jiggled and joggled around until at least every single one of those millions of tiny pieces is fitted back into its right place, just like a jigsaw puzzle. And presto, the photograph appears on the screen. That isn't exactly how it works, Mike TV said. I'm a little deaf in my left ear. You must forgive me if I don't hear everything you say. I said this isn't exactly how it works, shouted Mike TV. You're a nice boy, Mr. Wonka said, but you talk too much. Now then, the very first time I saw ordinary television working, I was struck by a tremendous idea. Look here, I shouted. If these people can break up a photograph into millions of pieces and send the pieces whizzing through the air and then put them back together again at the other end, why can't I do the same thing with a bar of chocolate? Why can't I send a real bar of chocolate whizzing through the air in tiny pieces and then put the pieces together at the other end, all ready to be eaten? Impossible, said Mike TV. You think so? Cried Mr. Wonka. Well, watch this. I shall now send a bar of my very best chocolate from one end of the room to the other by television. Get ready there. Bring in the chocolate. Immediately, 6 Oompa Loompas marched forward, carrying on their shoulders the most enormous bar of chocolate Charlie had ever seen. It was about the size of a mattress he slept on at home. It has to be big, Mr. Wonka explained, because whenever you send something by television, it always comes out so much smaller than it was when it went in. Even with ordinary television, when you photograph a big man, he never comes out on your screen any taller than a pencil, does he? Here we go then. Get ready. No, stop, hold everything. You there, Mike TV, stand back, you're too close to the camera. There are dangerous rays coming out of that thing. They could break you up into a million tiny pieces in 1 second. That's why the Oompa Loompas are wearing spacesuits. The suits protect them. All right, that's better. Now then, switch it on. One of the Oompa Loompas caught hold of a large switch and pulled it down. There was a blinding flash. The chocolate's gone, shouted Grandpa Joe, waving his arms. He was quite right. The whole enormous bar of chocolate had disappeared completely into thin air. It's on its way, cried Mr. Wonka. It is now rushing through the air above our heads in a million tiny pieces. Quick, come over here. He dashed over to the other end of the room where the large television set was standing, and the others followed him. Watch the screen, he cried. Here it comes. Look. The screen flickered and lit up. Then suddenly a small bar of chocolate appeared in the middle of the screen. Take it, shouted Mr. Wonka, growing more and more excited. How can you take it? Asked Mike TV, laughing. It's just a picture on a television screen. Charlie Bucket, cried Mr. Wonka. You take it. Reach out and grab it. Charlie put out his hand and touched the screen, and suddenly, miraculously, the bar of chocolate came away in his fingers. He was so surprised he nearly dropped it. Eat it, shouted Mr. Wonka. Go on, eat it. It'll be delicious. It's the same bar, it's just got smaller on the journey, that's all. It's absolutely fantastic, gasped Grandpa Joe. It's a miracle. Just imagine, cried Mr. Wonka, when I start using this across the country. You'll be sitting at home watching television, and suddenly a commercial will flash onto the screen, and a voice will say, Eat Wonka's chocolates. They're the best in the world. If you don't believe us, try one for yourself now. And you simply reach out and take one. How about it, eh? Terrific, cried Grandpa Joe. It will change the world. Chapter 27. Mike TV is sent by television. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe at seeing a bar of chocolate being sent by television. But Mr. Wonka, he shouted, can you send other things through the air in the same way? Breakfast cereal, for instance. Oh, my sainted aunt, cried Mr. Wonka, don't mention that disgusting stuff in front of me. Do you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those little curly wooden shavings you find in pencil sharpeners. But could you send it by television if you wanted to, as you do chocolate? Asked Mike TV. And what about people? Could you send a real live person from one place to another in the same way? A person? Cried Mr. Wonka. Are you off your rocker? But could it be done? Good heavens, child, I really don't know. Suppose it could. Yes, I'm pretty sure it could. Of course it could. I wouldn't like to risk it, though. It might have some very nasty results. But Mike TV was already off and running. The moment he heard Mr. Wonka saying, I'm pretty sure it could, of course it could, he turned away and started running as fast as he could towards the other end of the room, where the great camera was standing. Look at me, he shouted as he ran. I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television. No, cried Mr. Wonka. Mike, screamed Mrs. TV. Stop, come back. You'll be turned into a million tiny pieces. But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompas right and left as he went. "See you later, alligator," he shouted, and he pulled the switch down, and as he did so, he leaped out into the full glare of the mighty lens. There was a blinding flash. There was silence. Then Mrs. TV ran forward, but she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and as she stood there, she stood staring at the place where her son had been, and her great red mouth opened wide, and she screamed, "He's gone, he's gone!" "Great heavens, he has gone," shouted Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. "We shall have to hope for the best," he said. "We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed at the other end." "Mike!" she screamed, clasping her head in her hands. "Where are you?" "I'll tell you where he is," said Mr. TV. "He's whizzing around above our heads in a million tiny pieces." "Don't talk about it," she wailed. "We must watch the television set," said Mr. Wonka. "He might come through at any moment." Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered around the television and stared tensely at the screen. The screen was quite blank. "He's taking a heck of a long time to come across," said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear, I do hope that no part of him gets left behind." "What on earth do you mean?" asked Mr. TV sharply. "I don't wish to alarm you," said Mr. Wonka, "but it does sometimes happen that only about half of the little pieces find their way into the television set. It happened just last week. I don't know why, but the result was that only half a bar of chocolate came through." Mrs. TV let out a scream of horror. "You mean only half of Mike is coming back to us?" she cried. "Let's hope it's the top half," said Mr. TV. "Hold everything," said Mr. Wonka. "Watch the screen. Something's happening." The screen had suddenly begun to flicker. Then some wavy lines appeared. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs, and the wavy lines went away. And now, very slowly, the screen began to get brighter and brighter. "Here he comes. Yes, that's him, all right." "Is he all in one piece?" cried Mrs. TV. "I'm not sure. It's too early to tell." Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer every second, the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving at the audience and grinning from ear to ear. "But he's a midget," shouted Mr. TV. "Mike," cried Mrs. TV, "are you all right? Are there any bits of you missing?" "Isn't he going to get any bigger?" shouted Mr. TV. "Talk to me, Mike. Say something. Tell me you're all right." A tiny little voice, no louder than the squeaking of a mouse, came out of the television set. "Hi, Mum," it said. "Hi, Bob. Look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television." "Grab him," ordered Mr. Wonka. "Quick!" Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked the tiny figure of Mike TV out of the screen. "Hooray!" cried Mr. Wonka. "He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed." "You call that unharmed?" snapped Mrs. TV, peering at the little speck of a boy who was now running to and fro across the palm of her hand, waving his pistols in the air. He was certainly not more than an inch tall. "He's shrunk," said Mr. TV. "Of course he's shrunk," said Mr. Wonka. "What did you expect?" "This is terrible," wailed Mrs. TV. "What are we going to do?" And Mr. TV said, "We can't send him back to school like this. He'll get trodden on. He'll get squashed. He won't be able to do anything." "Oh, yes, I will," squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV. "I'll still be able to watch television." "Never again," shouted Mr. TV. "I am throwing the television set right out of the window the moment we get home. I've had enough of television." When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible tantrum. He started jumping up and down on the palm of his mother's hand, screaming and yelling, and trying to bite her fingers. "I want to watch television. I want to watch television." "Here, give him to me," said Mr. TV, and he took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast pocket of his jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook as the furious little prisoner fought to get out. "Oh, Mr. Wonka," wailed Mrs. TV, "how can we make him grow?" "Well," said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard and gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling, "I must say that's a wee bit tricky. But small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They stretch like mad. So what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that will bring him back to what he was. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. Teeby. Don't mention it, my dear lady. How far do you think he'll stretch? Asked Mr. Teeby. Maybe miles. Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it. You mean like chewing gum? Exactly. How thin will he be? Asked Mrs. Teeby anxiously. I haven't the foggiest idea, said Mr. Wonka. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. All we'll have to do is give him a triple overdose of my wonderful supervitamin chocolate. Supervitamin chocolate contains huge amounts of vitamin A and vitamin B. It also contains vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin F, vitamin G, vitamin I, vitamin J, vitamin K, vitamin L, vitamin N, vitamin O, vitamin P, vitamin Q, vitamin R, vitamin T, vitamin U, vitamin V, vitamin W, vitamin X, vitamin Y, and, believe it or not, vitamin Z. The only two vitamins it doesn't have in it are vitamin S, because it makes you sick, and vitamin H, because it makes you grow horns on the top of your head like a bull. But it does have it in a very small amount of the rarest, most magical vitamin of them all, vitamin Wonka. And what will that do to him? Asked Mr. Teeby anxiously. It'll make his toes grow out until they're as long as his fingers. Oh no, cried Mrs. Teeby. Don't be silly, said Mr. Wonka. It's most useful. He'll be able to play the piano with his feet. But Mr. Wonka, no arguments, please, said Mr. Wonka. He turned away and clicked his fingers 3 times in the air. An Oompa Loompa appeared immediately and stood beside him. Follow these orders, said Mr. Wonka, handing the Oompa Loompa a piece of paper on which he'd written full instructions, and you'll find the boy in his father's pocket. Off you go. Goodbye, Mr. Teeby. Goodbye, Mrs. Teeby, and please don't look so worried. They'll all come out in the wash, don't worry. You know, every one of them. At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down onto the rhythm. There they go again, said Mr. Wonka. I'm afraid you can't stop them singing. Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and the two of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of the long, bright room, listening to the Oompa Loompas, and this is what they sang. The most important thing we've learned so far as children are concerned is never, never, never let them near your television set. Or better still, just don't install the idiotic thing at all. In almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. Last week in someone's place we saw a dozen eyeballs on the floor. They sit and stare and sit until they're hypnotised by it. Until they're absolutely drunk with all that shocking, ghastly junk. Oh yes, we know, it keeps them still. They don't climb onto the windowsill. They never fight or kick or punch. They leave you free to cook the lunch and wash the dishes in the sink. But did you ever stop to think, to wonder just exactly what this does to your beloved Tot? It rots the senseless in the head. It kills imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind. It makes a child so dull and blind he can no longer understand a fantasy or fairyland. His brain becomes as soft as cheese. His powers of thinking rust and freeze. He cannot think, he only sees. All right, you'll cry, all right, you'll say. But if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. Well, answer this by asking you, what use the darlings ones to do? How use they keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten, don't you know? Well, say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read, and read and read, and then proceed to read some more. Great Scott, gadzooks! 1/2 their lives was reading books. The nursery shelves held books galore. Books cluttered up the nursery floor. And in the bedroom by the bed, more books were waiting to be read. Such wondrous, fine, fantastic tales of dragons, gypsies, queens, and whales, and treasure isles and distant shores, where smugglers rode with muffled oars, and pirates wearing purple hats, and sailing ships and elephants, and cannibals crouching round the pot, staring away at something hot. It smells so good, what can it be? Good gracious, it's Penelope. The younger ones had Beatrix Potter with Mr. Todd and the Dirty Rotter, and Squirrel Nutkin, Pigling Bland, and Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, and just how the camel got his hump, and now the monkey lost his rump, and Mr. Toad, bless my soul, there's Mr. Rat and Mr. Mole. Oh, books, what books they used to know, those children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray, go throw your TV set away, and in its place you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with lots of books, ignoring all the dirty looks, the screams, the yells, the bites, the kicks, and children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll now begin to feel the need of having something good to read. And once they start, oh boy, you watch the slowly growing joy that fills their hearts. They'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they've ever seen. In that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later, each and every kid will love you more for what you did. P.S. Regarding Mike TV, we very much regret that we shall simply have to wait and see if we can get him back his height, but if we can't, it serves him right. Chapter 28. Only Charlie left. Which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka as he turned away and darted into the lift. Come on, hurry up, we must get going. And how many children are there left now? Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe looked back at little Charlie. Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now. Mr. Wonka swung around and stared at Charlie. There was a silence. Charlie stood there, holding tightly onto Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Mr. Wonka said, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie. Yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. But my dear boy, he cried out, that means you've won. He rushed out of the lift and started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. Oh, I do congratulate you, he cried. I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful this is. I had a hunch, you know, right from the beginning, that it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie, well done. This is terrific. Well, the fun is really going to start, but we mustn't dilly, we mustn't dally. There's even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous number of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that have to be made, and the people we have to fetch. But luckily for us, we have the great glass lift to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie boy, jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you. That's the way. Now then, this time I shall choose the button we're going to press. Mr. Wonka's bright twinkling blue eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought, but he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited, and so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the lift. Charlie and Grandpa Joe both craned their necks to read what it said on the little label beside the button. It said up and out. Up and out, thought Charlie. What sort of a room is that? Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. Hold on, cried Mr. Wonky. Then wham! The lift shot straight up like a rocket. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs, and Mr. Wonka was holding onto a strap from the ceiling, and up they went. Up, 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 straight up this time, with no twistings or turnings, and Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside as the lift went faster and faster. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Again, yippee! Here we go. Faster! Cried Mr. Wonka, banging the wall of the lift with his hand. Faster, faster! If we don't go faster than this, we shall never get through. Through what? Shouted Grandpa Joe. What have we got to get through? Aha! Cried Mr. Wonka. You wait and see. I've been longing to press the button for years, but I've never done it until now. I was tempted many times. Oh yes, I was tempted. But I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys, up and out. But you don't mean, shouted Grandpa Joe, you don't really mean that this lift... Oh yes, I do. You wait and see. Up and out. But it's made of glass, shouted Grandpa Joe. It'll break into a million pieces. I suppose it might, said Mr. Wonka, cheerful as ever, but it's pretty thick glass all the same. The lift rushed on, going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Then suddenly Crash! And the most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came from directly above their heads, and Grandpa Joe shouted, "Help! It's the end! We're done for!" And Mr. Wonka said, "No, we're not. We're through. We're out." Sure enough, the lift had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising into the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring in through the glass roof. In 5 seconds they were 1,000 feet up in the sky. "The lift's gone mad," shouted Grandpa Joe. "Have no fear, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, calmly, and he pressed another button. The lift stopped. It stopped and hung in mid-air, hovering like a helicopter, hovering over the factory and over the very town itself, which lay spread out below them like a picture postcard. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the very small faraway houses and the streets and the snow that lay thickly over everything. It was an eerie and frightening feeling to be standing on clear glass high up in the sky. It made you feel that you weren't standing on anything at all. "Are we all right?" cried Grandpa Joe. "How does this thing stay up?" "Sugar power," said Mr. Wonka. 1,000,000 sugar power. "Oh, look," he cried, pointing down. "There go the other children. They're returning home." Chapter 29. "We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the lift dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just outside the gates. "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike TV, Mr. Wonka said, "but he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. "Yes," Charlie said. "What are they for?" "Don't you remember what it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of sweets. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim." Mr. Wonka went on. "Ah, there goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father." "You mean he's really all right?" asked Charlie, astonished. "Even after going up that awful pipe?" "He's very much all right," said Mr. Wonka. "He's changed," said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. "He used to be fat, and now he's thin as a straw." "Of course he's changed," said Mr. Wonka. "He got squeezed in the pipe, don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as they managed to dejuice her after all that. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks, much better than before. But she's purple in the face." "Oh, so she is. Oh, well, there's nothing we can do about that." "Good gracious," cried Charlie. "Look at poor Veruca's Salt, and Mrs. Salt, and Mr. Salt. They're simply covered with rubbish." "And here comes Mike TV," said Grandpa Joe. "Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire. They've overstretched him on the gum-stretching machine. How very careless." "But how dreadful for him," cried Charlie. "Nonsense," said Mr. Wonka. "He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now," he added, "it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie." Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the lift swung upwards into the sky. Chapter 30. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass lift was now hovering high over the town. Inside the lift stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with a most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes. I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on, staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I'm very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, And all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes. And he said, "You see, my dear boy, I've decided to make you a present of the whole place. Oh, as soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words could come out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I really am giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" asked Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But why would you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He'll try to do things his own way, and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious, sweet-making secrets while I am still alive." "So that is why you sent out the golden tickets," cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner. But, Mr. Wonka, do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of the enormous factory to little Charlie? After all, there's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass floor at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's that little cottage on the right at the edge of the town. The tiny little one." "I see it," cried Mr. Wonka. And he pressed some more buttons, and the lift shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George." "But they must come too." "They can't. They're very old. They haven't been out of bed for 20 years. "Then we'll take the bed along with us." "There's plenty of room in this lift for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing is impossible. Just you watch." The lift was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right on in to fetch them." "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" Crash went the lift, right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought that the end of the world had come. Grandma Georgina fainted, Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth, Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the lift. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him to run it, and he's given it all to me. And what are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on you're never going to need it again anyway." "Who is this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "this is Mr. Willy Wonka." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to figure out how to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the lift. "I'd rather die in my bed," shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I," cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the lift. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the lift rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof and into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the 3 old people, who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened. It's quite safe, and we're going to be in the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." Oh my god. There's a thing at the end for a competition for Are You Roald Dahl's #1 fan? And it says, "The offer closes the 1st of January 2000. I really, really hope you've enjoyed this. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading to you, and I have a few ideas as to what I could read next. I need to do some research, make sure that nothing's copyrighted or anything, but I maybe have a couple of options, so potentially The Hobbit, maybe, or Narnia. That sprung to mind. Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, because I've got the box set, actually the Narnia box set at home, which was actually belongs to my parents, but I remember my dad reading them to me when I was really young. So yeah, maybe Narnia, but I'll double check that they're okay to read, because I would have thought they would be, but I don't know. But yeah, or let me know whether you'd prefer to hear The Hobbit, but I'll try and bring Narnia. I think I want to read Narnia next, as long as everything's okay with it, but it's a lovely story, Narnia. But yeah, so I thoroughly hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you very much to those who encouraged me to pick it up again and finish telling you the story. And I also appreciate all of your support, because I've been getting a lot of messages. I think because I've probably been a bit distant, I've had a few of you, quite a few of you actually, asking me if I'm okay, and that you're there for me if I want to talk to you. So I thoroughly appreciate that. That's really thoughtful of you, and yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I hope you're lovely and relaxed.